Situated in North Cornwall, and known for its desolate beauty, sits the bleak and otherworldly Bodmin Moor. An 80-mile stretch of barren, bracken-choked solitude, dotted with peat-filled bogs and wild, free-roaming ponies. Its storm-battered landscape and ethereal contours have bewitched the human imagination for centuries. Standing at the moor's western edge and marking a dark and evocative portal between its misty hills and the working town of Bodmin, is a sumptuous place that offers warmth, comfort, fine dining, elegance, and luxury. Yet within the impenetrable walls of this sanctuary of indulgence and inviting hospitality lies an infamous and menacing history. As the building was once one of England's most brutal and feared penitentiaries. One where, far from choosing to stay, its dread-filled guests were desperate to escape. Known as one of the UK's most infamous and disturbing locations, and consistently appearing at the top of any list of its most haunted sites. This is Bodmin Jail. Or, as it's known today, the Bodmin Jail Hotel and Museum. Falling into decay following its closure in 1927, and standing hauntingly empty for many decades, wealthy investor Timur Gorman fell in love with the historic ruin during a rainy Cornwall holiday in 2015. He knew straight away that he just had to buy the notorious landmark. With a passionate resolve, and working alongside the brilliant designers at company 12 Architects, Mr. Gorman invested millions into its transformation. The place that was once infamous for its barren isolation, merciless brutality, and unflinching executions, held in front of raucous, jeering crowds, was transformed into a stunning, much-coveted destination. A magnificent metamorphosis, its breathtaking transition from chilling institution to lush retreat, creating an intoxicating conversion that draws visitors from all over the world. Attracted not just to the lavish surroundings or the warmth of its welcome, but for its spellbinding history and its plethora of ghostly inmates. As this famously haunted building doesn't shy away from its past or seek to hide it away, it fully and unashamedly embraces it. The Grade 2 listed 18th century prison once used to detain the most dangerous, deviant, and downtrodden in society, now offers guests an experience unlike any other. A vast glass roof floods the space with natural light. But beneath it, a staggering 85% of the original fabric of the building remains, quietly preserving the jail's sense of history. and guarding the distinctive aura that once defined its haunting ruins. Walkways and meshed landings still stand in place, eerie reminders of their original purpose. The once forsaken cell blocks now house the hotel's 70 rooms, as well as part of its museum. Each room has been formed by combining 3 former cells into a single, spacious suite, complete with an elegant, modern bathroom. A transformation that feels almost at odds with what these walls once witnessed. A sobering reminder of the claustrophobic captivity that once completely governed life here. Barred windows and vaulted ceilings continue to frame the space, while inscribed memorial plaques tell the stories of prisoners who were once inmates at Bodmin Jail, the crimes they committed, and the fate that awaited them. A distinctly personal and quietly unsettling detail that, while fascinating, brings the past even closer. Especially as you settle in for the night. And while the building now provides comfort in abundance, it never lets you forget what it once was. Once a place of reflective silence, the hotel's restaurant and bar now occupy the site of the original prison chapel, offering diners a true rendezvous with history, summoning images of a former time, when this very space would have echoed with panicked convicts facing a date with the hangman, desperate to make confession and find peace with their maker. Terrified of the judgment they feared awaited them. Another fascinating and stark contrast is the carefully curated champagne bar. It is set within what were once the private quarters of the Bodmin Jail governor. Just imagine all that once took place there, under what would doubtless have been the governor's eagle-eyed and uncompromising presence, where weighty decisions on discipline, punishment, and condemnation would once have dominated his domain. But Bodmin Jail is not just a place to stay. Another layer of the experience lies within its museum. Here, narrow passageways, darkened spaces, and cold stone walls trace a journey through centuries of crime, punishment, and prison life. While heritage guides lead visitors through the building's core, its cramped cells, gallows, and Victorian execution pit. Long regarded as one of the most haunted places in the country, the jail has come to embrace this part of its identity. Its museum now offering candle-lit ghost walks and overnight investigations, drawing the brave into its most haunted wings, cells, and deserted corridors. But what is it that still clings to Bodmin Jail? Has the sheer weight of shared human misery, violent death, dread, and trepidation somehow bled into these stone walls over centuries? Or do the tormented souls of its previous occupants remain tethered, unable to move on, shackled by crippling emotions of trauma, distress, or perhaps an enraged sense of injustice? To try and understand the ghosts that still haunt this iconic building, and why it's still plagued by such disturbance, let's go back to how it all began. In the historic part of Bodmin's town centre, standing at number 16 Crockwell Street, and just half a mile from Bodmin Jail, is an old pub called the Hole in the Wall. Built in 1779 and bursting with character, this classic drinking den stands on what was once the site of the county debtors' prison, a place whose conditions were so harrowing it would ultimately help shape the creation of Bodmin Jail itself. From 1749, the jail was known locally as the Sheriff's Ward, a facility that detained citizens unable to pay even the smallest of debts. Creditors could have debtors imprisoned through a civil process, often without anything resembling a fair or proper trial. Prison conditions were brutal and grim. Destitute inmates were confined to unsanitary, cramped, and cheerless cells without heat or bedding. Often close to starvation and denied meaningful contact with the outside world, many relied on loved ones and the kindness of strangers who would pass food and water through a hole in the exterior wall. And it's from this rather haunting connection that when built on the site, the Georgian pub took its name. In 1777, while carrying out the research for his pioneering study, The State of the Prisons in England and Wales, prison reformer John Howard paid a visit to the debtors' jailhouse. He was deeply shocked by what he found, describing such institutions as filthy, corrupt, and unhealthy. His blistering critique helped to ignite a nationwide drive for prison reform and a new approach to incarceration. Just 2 years after John Howard's report, military engineer and former High Sheriff Sir John Call designed and oversaw the construction of a new jail at Bodmin, upon the very site that remains in use today. The formidable structure was built from around 20,000 tons of local granite. In a feat of back-breaking labour, the giant boulders were carried by hand from Bodmin Moor and Cuckoo Quarry by French prisoners of war captured during the American War of Independence. But in a dark and cruel irony, they didn't just build a landmark. They built the very walls that would cage them, as these prisoners were among the first to be locked behind its newly completed walls. The new jail proved groundbreaking, providing individual cells with segregated wings for men and women, improved ventilation, running hot water, and properly paid jailers. But despite being founded on the back of John Howard's philosophy and commitment to rehabilitation rather than just punishment. Bodmin Jail quickly spiraled into a terrifying and notorious institution. Operating a merciless regime, it descended into a place of misery and suffering, and one that left little room for hope. In 18th century England, a spine-chilling legal system had operated, known as the Bloody Code. A time when the scales of justice were hopelessly crooked, and over 200 crimes were designated as hanging offences. So whether a convict was a cold-blooded killer, the father of a hungry family who stole a sack of wheat, or a desperate soul exercising a momentary lapse of judgment, all met their end on the Bodmin scaffold. Like the case of 55-year-old John Hoskin, who was publicly executed at Bodmin in August 1796. His crime? Stealing wheat from a house in Redruth. Or that of 20-year-old Elizabeth Osborne, who in 1813 was also hanged there before a baying crowd. Full of resentment and in a fit of rage at being dismissed, Elizabeth had set fire to a crop of corn belonging to her former boss. But there was no shortage of executions at Bodmin Jail for those who were convicted of more heinous crimes. Between 1785 and 1909, 55 people met their end at the Bodmin gallows, including 8 women. Women like Sarah Polgrean. Aged 37, Sarah's early life had been shaped by struggle and hardship, only to be followed by the atrocious violence of her abusive and much older husband, Henry. On the 15th of July, 1820, Sarah made a decision that would seal both their fates. She purchased arsenic. But instead of using it to kill rats, as she would later claim, Sarah added it to the butter in Henry's evening meal. It took 3 agonising days for the poison to do its work. Suspicions were raised, and soon, so was the body of Henry Polgrean, exhumed just 12 days after he was laid to rest. Following her conviction at Cornwall Assizes, and the sentence of death was passed, Sarah collapsed. And like that of so many others, her end came not in silence, but in a public spectacle. Just 2 days after she was found guilty, Sarah was brought before a massive crowd, eager to witness her last breath. She prayed with the prison chaplain and confessed to her crime. It is said that Sarah Polgrean was so tiny, so frail, that the primitive hanging methods of the day failed her, and she suffered a slow, excruciating end. For an hour, Sarah's body remained on the rope. And in a final indignity, Sarah was denied a grave, as her body was taken down and handed over for public dissection. A dire warning to anyone tempted to follow her fatal path. Sarah Polgrean was sadly not the last person to face mocking crowds at Bodmin Jail. But what unfolded almost 2 decades later would surpass anything Cornwall had seen before. When the public appetite for the macabre event reached a peak so dramatic, so troubling to polite society, that it would help bring an end to the uncivil practice altogether. On the evening of Sunday, the 12th of April, 1840, the town of Bodmin carried the air of excitement, almost that of a carnival. Alehouses and private homes were packed with visitors who had been arriving since Friday. A special excursion train from Wadebridge brought more than 1,000 passengers. And by noon the following day, the town had swollen to nearly 25,000 people, all making their way to Bodmin Jail. Trains even stopped beneath the prison walls to give passengers a better view. They had all come to watch two men perish. Two brothers, William and James Lightfoot. To the delight of the baying crowd, the Lightfoots met the noose side by side. The ultimate price for the callous robbery and murder of timber merchant Neville Norway. Showing no brotherly loyalty, they had tried to blame one another until the very end. But they met their end together, in one of Bodmin's most notorious double executions. Prison warders were left quite stunned by how well they slept the night before, even eating a hearty last breakfast the following morning. Showing no fear as they were brought to the gallows, it seems their cold indifference held until their very last breath. The spectacle of the Lightfoot executions had so repulsed respectable opinion and reformers that it marked a turning point in the nature of criminal punishment in England. With this shift in public sentiment, executions were gradually moved within prison walls. At the same time, the bloody code slowly began to unravel, as jurors increasingly refused to convict for lesser offences rather than condemn the accused to the gallows. Housing the growing number of inmates spared execution led to severe overcrowding and the spread of disease at Bodmin. A jail designed for little more than 60 individual cells was then expected to house all those who had escaped the noose. The need to expand coincided with the rise of a new philosophy, one that moved beyond mere containment. The Victorians believed the criminal soul could be corrected through discipline, structure, and total physical isolation. By the 1850s, Bodmin Jail was considered unfit for purpose. Under a vast reconstruction programme completed in 1861, it was rebuilt to reflect the demands of this new ideology. New wings were added, and long, ordered rows of individual cells created. Movement through the prison was carefully controlled, deliberately restricting contact, dividing prisoners at every turn. The architecture itself became a tool of reform, adopting what became known as the Separatist System, a regime first conceived at Pentonville Prison. Its principle was simple and chilling. Total isolation of each prisoner from every other human being at all times. Inside these cells, a prisoner's identity was systematically stripped away. Life revolved around prayer, labour, and reflection, all conducted in absolute silence. Conversation was strictly forbidden, with days broken only by the echo of a warder's or the prison chaplain's footsteps, or the heavy turn of a key. When prisoners were moved or allowed exercise, they were often hooded or masked. A faceless existence designed to prevent even the slightest human connection. The aim was punishment and forced reflection. Punishments at Bodmin included the brutal and exhausting machine known as the everlasting staircase, an enormous treadmill-like device where up to 32 prisoners at a time climbed for excruciating hours on end. While some powered shafts to mill corn, at Bodmin it often served no purpose at all. They were simply grinding the wind. The goal was to make these efforts deliberately pointless and soul-destroying. To inflict as much physical and mental exhaustion as possible, all viewed as a means of reform. But it was a different machine, the hard labour crank that gave prison officers the nickname that is still used today: screws. These individual cell-based contraptions were filled with sand to create resistance as a prisoner turned the handle. On a sadistic whim, wardens could simply tighten a screw on the side of the machine, cruelly increasing the agonising effort it took to turn it, often rendering it almost impossible. Failure to meet the daily quota of turns meant a prisoner could be denied food and rest, and risked being subjected to violence. More harrowing still is that it was not until 1865 that the law changed to determine a minimum age of 16 years to work these contraptions. Prior to that, children as young as 10 years old were treated the same as adults. This whole system, designed for contemplation and reflection. But in the damp, narrow confines of Bodmin Jail, that reflection often turned to madness. Reports began to emerge of broken minds and human spirits crushed by the strain of segregation. What the Victorians had once presented as a progressive path to salvation gradually revealed itself for what it truly was: psychological torture. Rather than reform the mind, the agony of enforced silence shattered it. As the 20th century approached, new ideas began to replace the old, placing greater emphasis on structured work, education, and controlled association rather than absolute separation. The heavy granite walls of Bodmin Jail had become relics of a failed experiment. Its rigid and unforgiving design was too expensive to maintain and too cruel to defend. In 1927, it slammed shut its heavy prison doors for the very last time. All remaining inmates were transferred to Exeter, leaving the abandoned structure standing silently, redundant, looking over the moor. Bodmin Jail had absorbed an extraordinary concentration of human suffering. During one of the cruelest chapters in the history of criminal punishment. With its valuable lead and slate roofs stripped shortly after closure, Bodmin Jail sat for decades, silently, staring down on the town, like a hollowed-out carcass. Could almost a century of invading nature and relentless Cornish rain wash away its sins? If places really can hold on to memories, then surely few buildings in England have more to remember than this one. Is there any better candidate for a haunting? It's perhaps no surprise that since its opening in February 2021, staff and visitors have reported ghost sightings and unexplained happenings all over the building, all supporting its reputation as among the most spiritually active sites in the country. The hotel's own record of documented paranormal encounters shows that many staff and guests who had no prior knowledge of the building's ghostly past describe remarkably similar experiences. A sheer accumulation of consistent testimony that is very difficult to ignore. Bodmin Jail Hotel takes these accounts seriously, including its leadership. After the hotel's appearance on Series 2 of Channel 4's World's Most Secret Hotels, Chief Executive Rob Cox spoke openly to the Daily Mail about what he and his staff have witnessed. He said, "There is no doubt, because of some of the things that have happened in the prison, things I've seen with my own eyes, that there are unexplainable occurrences happening there all the time. We've recorded on CCTV glasses moving across dinner tables, unexplained and in front of people's eyes. We've seen things jump from tables and move around. From the consistent patterns that emerge in what guests report during their stay, it seems reasonable to wonder whether something in the rooms themselves is determined to remind others of what they once were. Guests describe dragging sounds, tapping with no visible source, and the unsettling sensation of being watched or followed through corridors that moments earlier stood empty. Some have felt a hand placed firmly against their back. Others speak of clothing being tugged insistently, as though something unseen is trying to draw their attention. It isn't only the guests that seem affected. Phone batteries drain unexpectedly. Lights switch themselves off and on with a regularity that has prompted repeated electrical inspections. Inspections that reportedly found no obvious faults. Then there are the sightings, shadow-like figures standing silently in doorways, dark forms crossing television screens, or moving suddenly through the room before disappearing almost as quickly as they were noticed. Guests also report being woken in the early hours by the eerie sounds of phantom whistling. And tell of hearing faint whispers that seem to come from the original stone walls themselves. And perhaps most disturbing of all are reports of breathing, close, quiet, and with no clear source. Many visitors describe a heavy atmosphere within certain rooms, something beyond the natural unease of spending a night inside a former, infamous prison. Some admit that, despite the luxurious Egyptian cotton bedsheets, they have difficulty sleeping, something they put down to the persistent feeling that somehow the room is not entirely empty. Room 311 is the one staff identify as the most consistently active of all the guest rooms. From the outside, it is indistinguishable from its neighbours. The same dressed granite, the same proportions of combined original cells, transformed into a cosy, restful room. But its guests have reported a particular type of unease, a disturbing sense of being watched, as though the room is already being occupied by some unseen presence. As we've noted, this is experienced in many rooms at the hotel, but it's in 311 that it's most common. One guest described hearing an odd scratching sound coming from the small barred window, a sound she described as deliberate, like nails drawn purposefully across a surface, one that returned at intervals throughout the night. A close check of the window showed her that there was a considerable drop below, and no tree branches or pecking birds to explain it. Other occurrences in the room range from sudden cold spots, personal possessions mysteriously found in different parts of the room than they had been left, and a sensation of pressure, as though someone is sitting on the end of the bed. And it isn't only guests who have witnessed paranormal phenomena in room 311. Rhea Gillen, the hotel's housekeeping supervisor, is someone who moves through the rooms every day with a job to do. Appearing on Channel 4's The World's Most Secret Hotels, Rhea said, "Room 311 is very haunted. When you're in there cleaning the room yourself, the door opens and shuts to the bathroom." Rhea also said that she has seen the curtains fluttering in room 209 when there is no wind, and that one of her staff was once so troubled by one of the ghosts that she had to shout at the presence and tell it to leave. So why room 311? Directly below, perfectly preserved, and kept exactly as it was, sits the original condemned cell. The very room where prisoners spent their final night on Earth. Where men and women lay totally alone in the darkness, contemplating what the morning would bring. Just imagine, for more than 100 years, that small stone room absorbed a weight of human dread. It is almost impossible for us to comprehend. It's no secret that room 311 has developed something of a reputation. And today, many paranormal enthusiasts and the curious specifically request it. Arriving, already primed by its notoriety, by what they have read, by what they perhaps half hope and half fear they might encounter. Does that knowledge colour the experiences of some guests? Those who arrive expecting something may well find it. But here's what gives pause for thought. Many of the guests who have reported the most disturbing experiences in room 311 had no prior knowledge of the condemned cell below, and only learned of the history afterwards. Several doors along the same hotel corridor. Room 304 points to a different and more worrisome kind of disturbance. Whereas room 311 tends to feel more quietly oppressive and keenly watchful, room 304 has elicited reports of something far more agitated. Guests tell of waking in the night to a unique and crushing sense of emotion, one almost tangible and congealing the air. Several also describe seeing a presence standing silently at the foot of the bed, a form that radiates a sense of deep and cloying sorrow, as though burdened by guilt, panic, or shame, and engaged in some futile attempt to communicate. Others describe the figure standing motionless, as though staring out towards some long-vanished view beyond the window. The shape then disappears, leaving behind faint, muffled cries that seem to emanate from somewhere beyond the room itself. Could this be the same hooded figure that guests regularly report seeing, standing silently out in the central atrium of the hotel? Staff and visitors commonly report the sounds of faint sobbing and low, guttural cries of hopelessness that cling to the air, as though a chorus of suffering refuses to be silenced, begging to be remembered by anyone willing to listen. The echoes of cell doors slamming shut are also frequently heard, accompanied by the thunder of commanding voices that slice through the stillness. Among the creepiest and most frequently reported experiences are the sounds of heavy jangling keys and slow, deliberate footsteps. Footsteps treading rhythmically at a disciplined pace, with an authority witnesses consistently describe as professional. Most disturbingly of all, the footsteps are said to stop suddenly, outside certain rooms. Pause briefly, and then continue onward, as though a ghostly inspection or nightly round had just been completed. These phenomena have often been attributed to a former warder known simply as George, identified by many as George Harrison, who is said to have died at Bodmin while on duty in 1861. Census records from both 1851 and 1861 confirm that a prison warder and former Royal Marine named George Harrison lived and worked at Bodmin Jail with his wife, Elizabeth. Despite extensive research, however, no confirmed record of George's death appears to exist. In fact, following the 1861 census, both George and Elizabeth seem to vanish from the historical record entirely. Whether he died at the jail or simply moved on, it's sadly impossible to say. Witnesses have also described momentary glimpses of a silent, watchful, and solid-looking figure, standing upon the staircases that bridge the old administration block and guest wings. Many describe him as wearing a woolen cape, like that of a senior officer or governor, remaining motionless and staring down as though surveying a domain that was once entirely his. Although the final fate of George Harrison remains unconfirmed, the records do show another possible candidate, one whose connection may have run even deeper. In 1860, at the age of 70, Thomas Dungley died at Bodmin Jail. He had served as chief warder for 41 years, and before him, his own father had held the very same position. Oh, my apologies. I incorrectly refer to Thomas Dungy as Dungley here. Sorry, Mr. Dungy. Bodmin Jail was not merely Thomas Dungley's workplace. It was his inheritance, his life's work, and ultimately, the place where he drew his final breath. He gave evidence at the trial of the Lightfoot Brothers and witnessed some of the most brutal and transformative years in the prison's long history. If any soul had reason to remain, to watch over the place that had consumed an entire lifetime, perhaps it was his. So could Thomas Dungley be the source of the ghostly footsteps? Or perhaps the identity of the silent, sharp-eyed figure seen watching from the staircase? But unlike George Harrison, Thomas Dungley leaves behind something the records do confirm. More than 40 years of service, and a documented death within the very walls of Bodmin Jail itself.